Good morning, I'm Michele Conni. I am a PhD candidate at the Department of Computer Science in NTNU. And today I would like to discuss recent advances in texture synthesis. This is the structure of the presentation I will give. First of all, I will give a brief introduction to the topic and introduce some basic traditional texture synthesis approaches. Then I will explain how deep learning techniques can be applied to texture synthesis, especially the most recent generative adversarial networks. And finally, I will give a recap of various applications, recent applications, especially in the field of appearance and texture appearance, which is related to my PhD topic. The expected learning outcomes of this presentation are a basic knowledge on traditional and deep learning based texture synthesis methods, as well as an idea on the state-of-the-art applications of these methods. So let us start by defining what texture synthesis is. We can define texture synthesis as a process that takes a digital image as an input and learns how to generate samples with similar visual properties from it. This can be applied to various problems, such as texture reproduction, but also texture expansion. The evaluation criterion used to judge the quality of a synthesis method is usually achieved through human inspection, meaning that the synthesis method is successful if a human observer cannot tell the original texture from a synthesized one. There are various applications to texture synthesis. The most prominent ones are essentially image editing and 3D computer graphics. Traditionally, texture synthesis models can be divided into two major groups. The parametric texture synthesis methods that try to uniquely define a certain texture using various features, being then either statistical or others. For example, various successful parametric techniques are based on models inspired by the Malian early visual system. For example, Gabor filters or wavelet filters. The main disadvantage of these techniques is that it's very challenging to actually find a proper image statistics that could include all possible textures, especially with structured textures. Another typology of traditional synthesis models are the non-parametric ones, which essentially aim at generating new texture by resampling either pixels or patches of the input texture without changing its perceptual properties. The main drawbacks of these approaches are that they are usually slow and that they do not provide any texture model. The most successful parametric synthesis methods are usually based on a mix, on mixing the feature description of texture, of the input texture, with a scale decomposition that generates copies of the input at different scales. On the other hand, non-parametric synthesis techniques are usually divided in are more various. Markov random field based ones are usually generate new texture pixel by pixel by taking on the basis of the neighborhood of the pixel. On the other hand, stitching based methods try to extract random patches from the original image and merge them together in a homogeneous way. Finally, interpolation-based techniques try to essentially find a smooth transition between two different textures. As we said, traditional synthesis methods have various problems. Therefore, recently these have been overcame by deep learning based methods. These methods are based on neural networks, which are a topology of machine learning models inspired by the structure of the brain of animals. They are formed by very simple basic units that perform basic nonlinear calculations that are called neurons. The weights of these neurons, the parameters of these neurons can be adjusted and learned based on various training samples. The main drawback of neural networks is that they require a large amount of data, but otherwise they have been very popular since 2010 circa. For computer vision applications, a particular typology of neural networks has proven to be very effective, the convolutional neural networks. The first successful approach to neural networks to texture synthesis is based on this type of models and has been proposed by Gattis and colleagues. In particular, it has been based on a popular image recognition CNN called the VGG network. The weights of the VGG neurons, pre-trained for object recognition, have been used to extract statistical information on the image. This is achieved essentially. Here is the structure of the network used by Gattis and colleagues, and on the left you can see an analysis stage that uses the VGG to extract gram matrices from the input image, meaning the spatial average of the convolutional activation weights of the network. On the right, on the other hand, there's a synthesis step, which essentially iteratively applies forward and back propagation to optimize the input random noise image and to make its gram matrices match the input image matrices. The results of this process are shown here. The original image is the various original images are shown in the second column. In the first column, you can see the results obtained by Portillan and Simoncelli's algorithm that is the most successful parametric texture synthesis approach, while on the right you can see the results, the outputs of various pooling stages of Gattis CNN. Note that the last image in the bottom row is a non-textured image, and therefore the results don't really are not really good because of that. So Ulyanov and Ulyanov and colleagues in 2016 tried to improve Gattis' approach. The main limitation of Gattis' algorithm and method is that the iterative optimization procedure on which the synthesis and the generation is based is computationally quite expensive. To solve this, Ulyanov and colleagues essentially tried to generate textures with a feed-forward network. in this case, in this way, these techniques would be good for example, for video applications and for style transfer. This is here you can see the structure of texture nets, that is Ulyanov's network. It is a multi-scale network. Essentially, it uses a generator, essentially the network stage, that produces images from noise samples, and has a certain learned parametric theta. Again, the descriptor network is pre-trained, and it's used only to extract the texture loss as gram matrices. The network takes as input random images at various scales, and each input is processed with a convolutional neural layer. It is upsampled and concatenated to another input of bigger size. Another problem of Gatti's approach is that it does not account for large-scale regularity. Leo and colleagues tried to solve this by incorporating some low-frequency constraint into a CNN. To do this, they essentially added a loss term to the general loss of the VGG network and the Gatti's approach, which essentially forces the original input image to have a similar Fourier transform as the synthesized image to have a similar Fourier transform as the input image. A similar approach, or else an approach that tries to solve this same problem of structural form reproduction, was developed by Sandik and Cohenhor, and it corresponds to the deep core network. This network uses deep correlation matrices, which are essentially the autocorrelation of the activation functions, and to define a loss term that again is added to the traditional gram matrices based loss term used by Gattis. In this way, the structure of the neighboring pixels is taken into account in the optimization process. So just to recap these deep learning synthesis methods that we've seen. So we start with the Gattis and colleagues that essentially applied CNN networks to texture synthesis, then using them to extract statistical information from the activation functions of the network. This technique has also been used for neural style transfer, meaning that a typology of texture can be applied to another image while maintaining the content of the original image. The standard Gattis approach has been improved by in various ways. First of all, by texture nets with a feed-forward network, the introduction of feed-forward networks to make the generation faster. By Liu and colleagues that applied spectrum constraints to account for regularity of the input image, and for similar for a similar aim by the deep core network that essentially it essentially uses deep correlation matrices to achieve the same goal. A more advanced type of deep learning architectures is based on GANs, which means generative adversarial networks. GANs are unsupervised generative models formed by two neural networks, a generator and a discriminator. The aim of the generator is to reproduce a set of data X. Usually, this network achieves this by taking as an input a certain random noise that ensures that the outputs are always different. The discriminator, on the other hand, is a classifier that tries to tell the real input data from the fakes made by the generator. Both networks learn on the basis of cost functions derived from the output of the discriminator. In particular, the parameters of the discriminator are optimized to recognize real data from fake one, while those of the generator are aim at maximizing essentially the number of fake data recognized as real by the discriminator. True networks are usually trained in an alternate way. A first approach based on GANs to texture synthesis was developed in 2016 by Lee and Wand, and it's called a Markovian GAN or MGAN. The aim of this work was to essentially improve the deep learning synthesis efficiency, and this was achieved by essentially computing feature statistics based on Markov random fields. According to the authors of this work, traditional CNNs actually fit the data using a Gaussian distribution, while the data distribution is usually a complex manifold in the feature space, and GANs permit to fit this manifold essentially, and thus permit to avoid they can avoid various errors and aberrations generated by CNNs. The architecture of the MGAN is shown here in the slide. Essentially, the MGAN is based on various single layers of the VGG19 network. First of all, it takes the ReLU4 layer and uses it to extract a Markov feature map that is fed to the generative network G, which that essentially synthesizes the image. The discriminative network D in the green layer here on top is the discriminator, and learns to essentially therefore it learns to distinguish actual feature patches from inappropriately synthesized ones, and it extracts essentially a texture loss term. The below the line below, or the row below, is actually is obtained from a deeper layer in the VGG network, and therefore is a more abstract layer and accounts for content, and it's essentially an additional section of the network that can be used if also the content of the image needs to be fixed. A limitation of feed-forward methods, methods that we have described previously, is that they generally lack generality, meaning that one has to build a network per type of texture that has to be generated, and diversity, which means that they tend to always produce similar visual outputs, and finally they can be symmetrical sometimes. So to solve these problems, Lee and colleagues in 2017 have introduced this diversified texture synthesis network. This network essentially takes into account a certain one-hot encoded selection of texture, a vector that permits to the user to select which type of texture one wants to generate. This network is not exactly a GAN, because it, instead of a discriminator, it has a selector, which helps the generator to remember the various textures that on which it has been trained on. Another improvement of the methods proposed and based on GANs was developed by Yetchev and Bergman in various papers, and it's called periodic spatial GAN, or PS-GAN network. The original purpose of this network was to essentially synthesize texture, be able to synthesize texture of an arbitrarily large size. This was achieved by the basic spatial GAN, by defining a generator and a discriminator that are fully convolutional. This allows one to change the dimension of the input noise tensor, and based on this, the output will also change dimension accordingly. Moreover, to account for periodic and regular structures in the input texture, these Bergman and Yetchev proposed the PS-GAN, as we said, that is shown here in the image, and essentially to achieve the modeling of periodic and global structures in the image, they added multiple terms to the input tensor. A global term here, a standard random term, first of all, then a global term in purple here, and finally a periodic term that essentially is repeated periodically. It has a periodic structure in the space coordinates. Another problem of the networks that we have described until now is that they usually struggle with the expansion with texture expansion. This application is essentially consists in expanding an existing patch of texture, and this is achieved essentially as you see here using a GAN, and feeding as an input a cropped version of the input image, and then essentially adding taking into account a larger section of the original image to give a feedback on how well the generator performs. Here in this slide, I just wanted to show you how well the adversarial expansion performs. It's the first column here, in respect with the methods that we mentioned before, like TextureNext, DeepCorm, MGAN, and the PS-GAN. So just to summarize what we have learned about texture synthesis with GANs. First of all, we have MGAN, introduced in 2016. which essentially tried to improve traditional deep learning synthesis methods by applying GANs with Markovian features encodings. Then the same group proposed a network that learns to synthesize multiple textures at once using a generator and a selector network. Then Yetchev and Bergman developed a set of essentially a set of GANs that tries to synthesize textures of arbitrary size, which they have improved in time to account for periodic and global structures in the input texture. And finally, Zhu and colleagues have developed a GAN that permits to expand an existing texture patch in an optimal way. To conclude, I wanted to mention various applications of the techniques that we have described, and in general of texture synthesis, and in particular to the field of appearance and texture appearance. One of the drawbacks of GANs is that they are very difficult to explain and to control. Various recent papers tried to achieve user control. And in the next slides, I just wanted to give a brief overview of these. We start with this image of taken from Frustuk and a 2019 paper that introduced the tile GAN network. As the name suggests, the tile GAN is based on a GAN network, and it essentially tries to, it has the aim of producing a very large image, texture image, given a certain number, a large amount of input data, such as, for example, the topographical maps as shown in the images. And it uses essentially pre-trained generator network that creates a latent field of features, F, and F is optimized to follow a small target guidance map and to replace problematic tiles. And the artistic control is achieved by modifying and choosing the various tiles encoded in F. Another approach was proposed in always 2019 by Yu and colleagues, and they tried to achieve by example controllability on the interpolation of an arbitrary number of textures. This approach too encodes images in a latent space, as one can see here, using various encoding steps or layers. It's divided in two networks. The first one that reconstructs, and a reconstruction network that ensures that every input texture results in a similar texture after being encoded and decoded, while another one is an interpolation network that essentially mixes the two input image and essentially compares them to the original one, the two original images. Again, yet another controllable GAN was proposed by Darcy at the end of 2021, and is essentially based on concurrence matrices. So instead of using latent features, they used concurrence matrices informations extracted that are essentially statistical informations extracted from the input text. They add to these co-occurrence matrices random noise element, and then they provide this tensor as an input to the generator. And finally, the discriminator, essentially, this is a traditional GAN, so the discriminator tries to classify the original image and the synthesized image as fake or real. Another interesting work was proposed by Varcher and colleagues in 2020, and essentially they showed that that CNN activations of natural textures have an elliptical distribution in the feature space, and essentially use an optimal transport, the optimal transport theory to define a texture interpolation method. And finally, they demonstrate how to use this texture interpolation technique for human psychophysical experiments and monkey neurophysiology experiments. Another application of texture synthesis, a very recent and interesting application, is essentially the synthesis of solid texture. There are various techniques in this group of applications. One is the synthesis of porous media or textured 3D media, which can be applied, for example, to physical or fluid dynamics simulations. And this technique is essentially based on the traditional texture synthesis approaches or deep learning approaches. So they generate the 3D texture layer by layer as an image, while in more advanced techniques actually have been applied to essentially texture transfer on 3D structures and meshes or 3D objects. In this slide, you can see some examples of the first technique that I mentioned, applied to various meshes and shapes and objects. Another interesting approach of texture synthesis is dynamic texture synthesis. The most recent method was proposed by Tesfeldet and colleagues, and it essentially uses two different pre-trained networks. One pre-trained, essentially the VGG network pre-trained for object recognition, and the other one that checks essentially that is focused on the dynamic stream is pre-trained for optical flow prediction. From these, the network extracts the gram matrices that and then it mixes them to obtain essentially a general dynamics loss. The results are shown of these methods are shown on the images on the right, and you can see that the homogeneous this technique works well for the upper water texture, while in the candles, for the candles texture, it's not really able to recognize the fire from the candles themselves, and therefore it mixes all the elements and has and therefore the result is not so precise. A final example of texture synthesis application that I want to mention is texture synthesis for textiles. In particular, this paper, very recent paper from Guan and colleagues that develops a method that they call embroidery style transfer. Essentially, this method is a classical. It doesn't use deep learning. It's a classical, traditional synthesis method, and it can be divided into steps. A first step in which the image is segmented into different regions, and 3 different typologies of stitches are then assigned to each region based on its properties, mainly geometrical properties. And then a second stage that is a stitch style based texture synthesis that actually fits the various stitches inside every region. It can be used, as one can see in this bottom image, for essentially 3D reproduction of images and of embroidered objects on the web. So just to summarize what we have discussed about in this presentation, we have presented various traditional texture synthesis methods, which can be divided in parametric and non-parametric. Then we showed how deep learning approaches are currently provide the best synthesis results, in particular generative adversarial networks. And finally, we have seen various applications of texture synthesis, from user control to 3D texture synthesis to dynamic texture to essentially embroidery synthesis. Thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, I will be happy to answer to them.